what I think happened with regards to the origin of these profound stories is that people first started to behave in certain ways that had survival significance. And that was selected for as a consequence of the standard selection practices. And so that was instantiated in behavior. And then because we could observe ourselves, because we're self-conscious creatures, that we started to make representations of those patterns and dramatize them and then encapsulate them in stories. So it's a bottom-up so it would be sort of like chimpanzees or wolves become aware of their dominance hierarchy structures and the strategies that they use. So a wolf, for example, if two wolves are having a dominance dispute, the wolf that gives up first lays down and puts his neck open so the other wolf can tear it out, and then the other wolf doesn't. And you could say, well, it's as if a wolf is following a rule about not killing a weaker member of the pack. Of course, wolves don't have rules. They have behavioral patterns. But a self-conscious wolf would watch what the wolves were doing and then say, well, it's as if we're acting out the idea that each wolf in the pack has intrinsic value. And then that starts to be, and maybe the wolves would have a little story about the heroic, forbearing wolf that doesn't tear out the neck of its opponents, and that's good wolf. Well, that's good wolf ethics, and so, but it's grounded in the actual behavior. Okay, so we'll put that aside for a second. Now, here's the sacrificial story. So human beings have made sacrifices. It seems to be a standard practice all around the world. And in the biblical narratives, they would often sacrifice something of value, like a valuable animal.
Well, like a child. Let's start.
Well, look. I'm not making light of this. I know that human sacrifice was a part of this.
Yeah, but that's again. So just to give you a crib on where my mind goes here is human sacrifice is as old a religious precept as we know about.
Yes.
It's a cultural universal. The other sacrifices are derivations from it. Circumcision is a surrogate for the far more barbaric act of human sacrifice, and it answers every test you would put to it with respect to its archetypal significance, its compelling presence in stories across all cultures. But the horror is that it actually has taken place in all these cultures based on explicit beliefs in the presence of just
right. Well,
oppressive scientific ignorance.
Arthur Kessler used that as the argument for the essential insanity of humanity. Right?
No, but it's not just the insanity of humanity. It's the misapprehension of the causal structure of the cosmos. You don't know what controls the weather. Well, you don't know why people get sick. You think your neighbor is capable of casting magic spells on you. You're ignorant of everything, and you're trying to force some order on things. And so when you don't, in the absence of engineers, and you don't know why certain buildings fall down, you actually can agree with your neighbor that maybe you should bury your firstborn child into every post hole of this new building, which in fact took place. And it's the consequence of ignorance. And so the problem is, if you're only going to talk about this purified notion of sacrifice.
But it's a very strange consequence of ignorance, Sam.
It's the notion that we're in relationship to invisible others that can mistreat us based on our not having offered enough. Not precisely those others.
Well, but we're in relationship to the invisible others who will judge us in the future.
Okay, you're changing the noun in important ways.
I know, but I'm also trying to understand, and I'm not trying to argue against the horror of child sacrifice.
No, I would never imagine you would.
I know. But I'm also trying to.
But my work would be much easier if you did that.
Yes, and the work of journalists as well. Although they've tried that pretty much anyways.
That's right.
So. Right, that would even be worse than enforced monogamy, hypothetically.
No doubt.
Yes. So see, let's say that I'm trying to give the devil his due, and I'm trying to understand from an evolutionary perspective, like a cognitive, behavioral evolutionary perspective, let's say, why that particular set of ideas would emerge, and in many places, perhaps autonomously, or once having emerged, would spread like wildfire. It's like, because I'm not willing to only attribute it to ignorance. Now, we can attribute it to ignorance, no problem, man. But there's more going on there because it is a human universal. And there's all sorts of things that happen in nature as a consequence of biological and evolutionary processes that don't work out well for our current state of moral intuition, let's say.
Yes.
Okay, so one of the things, because I've been thinking about this sacrificial motif for a very long time, and trying to figure out what the hell's the idea here exactly. And so here's one way of thinking about it. If you give up something of value now, you can gain something of more value in the future. Okay, so let's think about that idea for a minute. So the first thing is, that's a hell of an idea.
Yeah,
that's delayed gratification.
Yeah, delayed gratification.
That's right. That's the discovery of the future as well. And so you might say, well, the notion of sacrifice is exactly the same thing as the discovery of the future. If we give up something we really value now, we can make a pact with the structure of existence itself such that better things will happen to us in the future. Now,
yes.
Okay, now, what's weird about this, and it's hard to understand, is that it works. So when I talk to my students, for example, and I say, what did your parents sacrifice to send you to university? Many of them are children of first-generation immigrants. And so, like, man, they're on that story in a second, right? They know all sorts of things that their parents sacrificed. And they're delaying gratification in the present for a radically delayed return in the future. Now, you think, animals, generally speaking, they might act out the idea of delayed gratification as a consequence of running out their instincts, but they don't conceptualize it. It's not obvious that animals give up something they value right now in order to thrive in the future. There's an old story about how to catch a monkey, right? So you put a jar up with rocks in it, and you put little candies, and it's a narrow-necked jar. You put little candies on top of the rocks, and you put a few candies in front of the jar. Then the monkey comes along and picks up the candies, puts his hand in the jar, grabs the candies, and can't get it out.
Yeah, I still don't know if this actually works on monkeys or if it's just a great story.
Well, I don't know. I don't know either. And I've heard various claims. But the point is, you can go pick up the monkey. He won't let go of the candies. Now, perhaps he would. But the issue is that it's not obvious that animals will forego an immediate gratification for a future gratification.
I don't think that's right, actually. And I actually want to hold.
Well, the question is, will they do it consciously? They might act it out. They act it out. That's not the issue.
It's very hard to know if it's conscious because they won't respond to the questionnaires. But
I know. And obviously, the line between acting it out and starting to consciously represent it is a tenuous one. But what looks to me like what happened is that after we observed that people who were capable of delaying gratification sacrificed things that they valued in order to obtain a future goal, and it worked, that we started to codify that as a representation and then started to act it out. And so the story, and you'd say, well, that produced strange variants, but there's a reason for that too, as far as I can say. So imagine this. Imagine that there's a rule of thumb. Sacrificing what you find valuable now will ensure certain benefits in the future. Well, then the question becomes, how good could those future benefits be? And so that might be heavenly, let's say, in the archetypal extreme. And what's the ultimate sacrifice that you have to perform? And then I would say, well, the child sacrifice fits into that category. And so it's as if those ideas were pushed to their radical extreme. And you could say, well, that's a pathological extreme. It's like, well, it is a pathological extreme, but I think we also have to understand that some of the things that we've learned as we've evolved towards our current state of wisdom, such as it is that they were learned in a very bloody and catastrophic way. They were learned with incredible difficulty. And delay of gratification was certainly one of those, because it's a hell of a thing to learn when you're in conditions of privation.
Okay. Yeah, I think that the issue here for me is that you don't need a conception of, you don't need any kind of positive gloss on human sacrifice as a meme or as an archetype in order to form a coherent picture of the future that can motivate you. So delayed gratification is fully separable from a notion that it might ever be rational or good to sacrifice a child as an offering to an invisible other that doesn't exist.
But how do you know it's separable? Because that's the developmental history. As you said, the sacrifices
even if
came first.
I think it is in fact historically separable, but let's just say it's not. Let's just say it's a matter of our origins. They're united. They're of a piece. It is the genetic fallacy to care about that origin. I mean, to say that that is the only path forward toward a notion of the future, given where we've come from. or that it's somehow necessary to venerate now, or that it's good that we took that path.
But we do venerate the idea of sacrifice now. But I would say that I would say
we do it to the detriment of our moral intuitions in the religious context. So, for instance, I think that the notion that Christianity is actually a cult of human sacrifice. Christianity is not a religion that repudiates human sacrifice. Christianity is a religion that says, actually, no, human sacrifice is necessary, and there was only one that, in fact, was necessary and effective, and that's the sacrifice of Jesus. And I think that is, when you dig into the details, not only a morally uninteresting vision of our circumstance and how we can be redeemed, it's morally abhorrent.
Okay.
Right? So I think there's better versions online.
Let me ask you a question about that. So, in the moral landscape, you lay out this pathway. There's the bad life, and there's the good life, right? And you described what they were, and the bad life is a variation of hellish circumstances, and the good life is a variant of, hypothetically, the life that we would like to lead. And your conception is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, your conception is that the proper pathway forward, so that would be the moral endeavor, is to move away from the bad and towards the good.
Yeah, insofar as we understand which way is up, yes.
Yes.
The basic claim is that we can be right or wrong with respect to our beliefs there.
True. We don't necessarily know how to do that in an unerring manner, and we could subject that to approximation correction along the way, and we should, but we can outline the broad scheme, which is progress away from hell towards something that's positive. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I would say that there's an implicit claim in that you should sacrifice everything in you that isn't serving that to that. And I would say that that's essentially the same claim that's made in Christianity.
Well, again, that is I understand the impulse to up-level these barbaric, ignorance-derived beliefs, right, to something that is morally, that is interesting and palatable in the current context. And I understand you can do that. My concern there is you can do that with everything. I mean, you could do it with witchcraft. Why not do the exact same thing you're doing with religion to the history of witchcraft? Witchcraft is as well
modern
described.
Witches would do that. So that's a perfectly valid criticism.
That should be of concern. I mean, there are reasons why we don't want to endorse modern witchcraft, right?
Look, absolutely. And so one of your
But I mean, I'm not talking. And modern witchcraft currently exists. I mean, you go to Africa, people are hunting albinos for their body parts because they believe in sympathetic magic, and kids get killed as witches. So this belief endures in certain pockets of humanity, and we're right to. I mean, I just think at a certain point you have to acknowledge that some ideas are not only wrong, but their effects are disastrous, or have been disastrous, or will likely be, even if good in certain circumstances, will likely be disastrous in the future. And then we shouldn't be hostage to these ancient memes. We shouldn't have to figure out how to make the most of the worst idea that anyone's ever had, which is maybe you should sacrifice your firstborn child to a being you've never seen.
Hold on, Sam. I want to hold your feet to the fire here a little bit. 2 points. One, interesting observation. When you presented the example, so on your podcast I had argued that believing that porcupines can throw their quills might protect you from a porcupine that might wheel around even though porcupines can't throw their quills. Your listener sent the better example, which was all guns are loaded. When you presented it, you didn't say all guns are loaded. Well, you said treat all guns as if they are loaded, which is, I think, the same reflex that you have faced with any metaphorical truth, which is that it can always be unpacked.
But actually, that's the way Jordan talks about believing in God as well.
Right, and actually, so this is. But then, if we take something like you say, all right, sacrifice of children is abhorrent. Let's say it is, and then you say, well, Christianity hasn't foregone the sacrifice of children. In fact, it's described one child who is sacrificed for everybody else. But arguably, that's an upgrade of some metaphorical truth that frees those who are adhering to this tradition from ever considering sacrificing a child. And what it does is it provides a motivational structure that may, in fact, have very positive outgrowths, though not literal. The idea that someone would have sacrificed their own child for the benefit of everybody else not to have to, that idea might engender a large amount of good work that would result, as Jordan is pointing out.
Let me just concede that the hardest case for me, I mean, which I did up top, just in defining, after you define metaphorical truth, and I use the gun example, there's certainly cases where the useful fiction is more useful than the truth. I would grant that, but I think those cases are few and far between. But handling guns is one of them. It's just not useful when the casino opens across the street and you can place $1 million bet, right? Then you want to have some purchase on the literal truth. So you want to be able to, and again, this is psychologically interesting because, and I keep coming back to the gun example because the one that is viscerally real to me. Like if I have a real gun that I know to be unloaded, I still emotionally can't treat it as a harmless object. I can't point it at my child just for the fun of it because that we're going to play cops and robbers now with a real gun, right? I have a superstitious attachment to always being safe with the gun, right? And it's important. It's important that get ingrained, and yet it is not strictly it's not irrational because it has good effects, but it's not actually in register with what I know to be true factually in each moment.
Right. So it's very low cost.
Yeah,
it's very low cost.
It's very low cost. It's not dividing societies and causing people to go to war.
And if you were going to teach a child gun safety, you would want to encode this so that they would automatically know never to behave as if a gun is unloaded, because that's what gets you into trouble. Yeah. As an adult, every gun owner recognizes the distinction between the metaphorical truth and the literal truth here. But I guess what I suspect is going on here is that your mechanism for dealing with the world involves unpacking all of these things. And I think it's highly productive. But it also means that you have a hard time understanding why anybody would do anything different. And that's the question, is just because we can track fully the difference between guns actually all being loaded and behaving as if all guns are loaded, right? That one, there's no leftover. There's no mystery there, right? But there may be many of these things for which there is some difficulty lining up the metaphorical truth with the literal truth, and operating according to the metaphorical truth might have advantages, which I think is what you're getting at.
So here's another situation, because we have to remember what kind of catastrophic past we emerged from and how much privation ruled the world prior to 1895, essentially. And certainly the farther back you go, the more bloody and horrible it was. I mean, how often do you think it was necessary, and this is not obviously something I'm in favor of, and this is also one of these situations where we get to play with ideas that we might not otherwise play with. How often do you think it was necessary for people in the past who had absolutely no access to birth control and who didn't have enough food to sacrifice a child for the survival of their family? I mean, God only knows, and that's worth thinking about. It's like, life is unbelievably cruel and difficult. And one of the problems that comes when you discover the future is that you might have to make the most painful of sacrifices. And lots of archaic people do this sort of thing. They do that with their elderly people. They do that with sick people. They do that with infants that they deem too fragile to survive. So part of child sacrifice, and I know the literature on child sacrifice reasonably well, part of child sacrifice seemed to emerge out of the observable necessity to leave someone behind so that everyone else didn't die. And we don't know how often that had to happen in the past. It might have had to happen a lot.
Right.
Now, obviously...
Although, just in the interest of kind of conceptual clarity here, human sacrifice is a larger horror than that. So you have, what was very common is the sacrificing of, captives. So you take the Aztec sacrifices where you now have slaves, some of whom you're going to...
Yeah, the Aztecs sacrificed about 25,000 people a year.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, it's clearly a bloody mess. There's no doubt about that. But, one of the things that you see happening in the biblical narrative, which is extraordinarily interesting, is that you see echoes of child sacrifice at the beginning. But what happens is the sacrificial notion gets increasingly psychologized as the story progresses. So, you see that transition with Abraham and Isaac, where the child sacrifice is actually forbidden, although previously demanded by God. And then you also see it, as you already laid out, in the substitution of the circumcision for the idea of sacrifice itself.
Right.
And then what seems to happen, see, I'm trying to figure out how these ideas develop psychologically from their behavioral underpinnings, is that eventually it becomes psychologized completely. So you can say, well, we can conceptualize a sacrifice in the abstract, so my parents can sacrifice to send me to university without anything or anyone having to die. It transforms itself from something that's enacted out as a dramatic ritual into something that's a psychological reality. But all that blood and catastrophe along the way is part of the process by which the idea comes to emerge.
Right.
It doesn't.
So what is the connection of all of this? Because yes, so there is this history, and I would argue we are busily trying to outgrow much of it, if not most of it, whether it's evolutionary history or just the cultural history.
We might be trying to transmute it so that it becomes, we can maintain, as you've suggested we do, we can maintain what's useful in the tradition and throw out everything that's pathological.
Yes, but we're constantly discovering a lack of fit between both what we perceive in ourselves as biological imperatives and the cultural legacies of just what mommy and daddy taught me was true, right? Which we have now every reason to believe might not be true. And we're trying to optimize our thoughts and institutions and relationships with one another for our current circumstance. And yet we have this legacy effect of certain books and certain ways of speaking have a completely different status. And they have this status because they may, in fact, it's imagined, not be the products of merely previous human minds, but they may be the products of omniscience.